Hello, South Africa, and welcome back to Coronacast, your twice-weekly information platform, keeping you up to date with the latest information relating to the coronavirus and the fight against it in South Africa. We apologize for the slight delay in start of programming today. We had a few network issues, but thank you for your patience and thank you for staying tuned in with us. Well, today is day 50 of the extended lockdown, and we're now 15 days into level 4 of government's risk-adjusted strategy. We've decided to add our daily statistics down to the bottom of the screen, so those of you who want to be kept up to date with what those daily statistics are of number of infections, number of deaths, and again our condolences and sympathies to those who've lost loved ones as a result of the virus. Please keep track on the underside of our screen, and it'll keep you up to date with those. I want to thank each and every one of you, South Africa, who have made a donation to our legal challenge to the extended lockdown and many aspects of it. And we're going to be traversing that a little bit later in the program. But thank you for your generosity. And I apologize for any of you who have been trying to make a donation and have been unable to do so. It's probably a good thing. Our website's been so overwhelmed with South Africans frustrated with the lockdown, frustrated with the infringements on their lives and their livelihoods, that our website's been battling to manage the traffic. So please do keep trying. You can log on to da.org.za, and there's a donate button there, and we've managed to put some extra capacity behind it to be able to accept your donations in our legal challenge against COVID-19. I was asked a strange question yesterday about who I speak for and who I fight for. And I want to make it very, very clear that we bring this action on behalf of all South Africans, the majority of whom are now getting very, very nervous and scared about what this lockdown means for them and their future viability. We've already seen a number of polls being done by newspapers and polling agencies which show that there is a growing anxiety amongst all South Africans from all communities about the extended lockdown and the effect and impact that it is having on people's ability to be able to provide for their families and to be able to sustain their future. So when people ask me, who do you speak for? I'm speaking for the 3 million South Africans who stand to lose their jobs as a result of a continuation of this hard lockdown. I speak for the millions of South Africans who are forced to break the law every day to sell atcha on the streets of South Africa so that they're able to provide for their families. I speak for the thousands upon thousands of business owners who have poured their life and their life savings into businesses which now face the real prospect of failure because of an ill-conceived extension of a hard lockdown. And I speak for the millions of South Africans who are really, frankly, tired of living under a military curfew and being confined to their exercise of 3 hours in the morning. And I speak for the future of our country. This lockdown and the extension of it is going to affect many, many more South Africans than the virus ever would. And so I'm proud to speak out on behalf of all of you, South Africa, in talking against this lockdown and talking for an opening, responsible approach to opening up our economy and ensuring that we can get South Africa and South Africans back to work as safely as possible. And so today, that's going to be the focus of our program. I've got some really exciting guests with me today, and many of you have been, through your written requests to our coronavirus website and our dedicated email line, been saying we'd like to hear from some medical experts about what is the science behind the lockdown. What are the medical implications of COVID-19 for South Africa? So today we answer your call, and I'm very excited to have with me today Professor Alex van der Heever from the Wits School of Governance. I have also a paediatric heart surgeon, Dr. Susan Vosloo, and anaesthetist, Dr. Anton Ferreira. Dr. Vosloo was the first woman to qualify as a cardiothoracic surgeon in South Africa and is a leading figure in the field of anaesthetics. And I also have with me today, back again for her second time on the Coronacast, Helen Zille, the Federal Executive Chairperson of the DA, where we're going to be discussing the nature and the tactics behind the legal challenge which we've instituted and which I was proud to announce yesterday to South Africa. So without further ado, I'm going to turn now to our guests, and I'll start with Professor Alex van der Heever. Now, Alex, for those of you who have been watching the media, have been reading a number of the literature and following the debate, would know that Alex and his team at Wits have been at the forefront on a lot of the scientific thinking behind the lockdown and particularly the effect of coronavirus on South Africa. And so, Alex, I'm very glad to welcome you today to Coronacast, and thank you for making the time to come and speak to us and through us to the many thousands of South Africans who are watching for information on the coronavirus. Alex, when we asked you about the efficacy of the lockdown, you had the following response to say: general lockdowns are now out of the question as a rational strategy. Smart testing and tracing is also in question, but the reporting is ambiguous. Antibody tests won't help with prevention. There's still some scope for rapid testing and tracing, but the window is virtually gone. Do you want to take us through a little bit why you said this and what your latest thinking is on this particular aspect of the virus?
Yeah, so thank you for the invitation, and I hope I can give some valuable input. I think maybe the first comment I'd make is, what was the purpose of the lockdown? What should it have been? The lockdown itself was essentially a mechanism to buy time. It was introduced very early on in the epidemic, unlike many other countries, and therefore should have suppressed the epidemic. All the other countries that have introduced generalized lockdowns of this nature have seen the reproduction rate of the disease move below 1. And therefore, you have the disease extinguished by the lockdown itself. So we should have seen such a trend under the lockdown itself, and we haven't. We saw it initially, and then we suddenly see this upward drift. So that's an important feature of this discussion, and how to understand what we're seeing. What that potentially indicates is that the lockdown itself has some problems being applied coherently in the South African context. And therefore, our strategies actually have to be sensitive to the context. And a generalized lockdown is not the best method of dealing with this kind of epidemic. So our densely populated areas, informal sector areas that are effectively unlockdownable, require a strategy that is a lot more surgical and a lot more targeted. So that's the first issue, is what should the lockdown have done? What should it have bought us time for? And what we're seeing now is there's a change in the narrative, in that in some senses the lockdown is being argued to have bought us time for to prepare hospital services for a storm. That's a very worrying scenario, because in fact the lockdown should have actually bought us time to put in place alternative strategies, not just to put in services so that our beds aren't overwhelmed. And this narrative is sort of cobbled together with an idea that we will only have an epidemic peaking in September. Now, the problem with that scenario, and I think just need to make it clear why it is a problem, is that it comes from a model analysis. And it actually suggests failure of our public health interventions, and it's banking on it. If we have a peak in September, our public health strategies have effectively failed, because our lockdown should have turned the epidemic down, driven it to 0 new infections. The fact that it hasn't means that lockdowns don't work. But we have to have a public health measure that does suppress the epidemic. So the alternative strategy, or the real strategy that the lockdown should have bought us time for, was to introduce testing and tracing, efficacious testing and tracing at scale. That was really our only strategy going forward, given the South African context. If I do a comparison with the UK, they will be telling you now that their lockdown has as its fundamental purpose now to get the new infection rates down to such a level that they can manage it with testing and tracing. So despite the fact that they had a disaster, they started too late, that is actually the logical transition. If you have a lockdown in the South African context where our new infections were low, it actually meant that testing and tracing was a feasible strategy at our current levels of the epidemic. So to introduce, so to suggest a continuation of the lockdown as our only method to manage the epidemic is suicidal in the South African context, economically and socially.
Yeah, I had this I had this debate yesterday, Alex, with Richard Calland on Twitter. And he says it's irresponsible to call for a lifting of the lockdown while transmissions are continuing. Now, to my mind, it misses the fundamental point that transmissions and infections are going to increase no matter what we do over the next few months, but we can't keep the economy in a hard lockdown for 18 to 24 months, or now, as the WHO are saying, the virus being with us longer. And the fact that we only yesterday, I think, breached the 400,000 test mark shows that we're falling way behind in the testing, tracing, and tracking analysis.
We've never had an option to continue with the lockdown as a strategy. The Northern Hemisphere industrialized countries are in a different position to South Africa. Firstly, the lockdowns work there. Secondly, they can survive a lockdown economically and socially. So they can, their social security systems are more intact, and their financial position, their fiscal position, is more sustainable. South Africa is not in that position at all. And the problem that we're going to face going forward is that our non-COVID related deaths and social impacts are going to completely outstrip the impact from COVID itself. So there's a cost-benefit analysis that you have to do on the social side. And so we have to weigh up in terms of a strategy, what is the most appropriate balance of strategies. So I'm not sure what thinking is behind Richard Calland's comment, but what I would say is that we had a feasible strategy to pursue, and government failed to invest in it. So it promised that we would have a testing capability within the National Health Laboratory Services of 36,000 tests a day by the end of April. They have failed to do that. And that means we're taking the most important strategy that can have an impact out of our, basically out of commission, leaving us exposed to a strategy of lockdowns which themselves don't work. So the problem there is that we've got to manage with the hand we've been dealt, and we've got to reopen the economy. The catastrophe from a fiscal side in South Africa is just unimaginable at this point. National Treasury barely knows what to do at this point. Now they were already in a hugely difficult position on the 35-day lockdown. But the longer the lockdown lasts, the longer the bridge that you have to create to keep businesses alive and to keep people alive. The bridge is too long if we have to look at a 2-year process of intermittent lockdowns to manage this epidemic. So there is a clear concern I have that we've been planning for failure, in that the lockdown wasn't used to actually build up our testing capacity, and that is really concerning. So if we had to look at what our options are going forward, I think that we still have to progressively improve the lockdown. There is a huge problem of transparency. We don't really have complete data on what's going on, which means that there are ambiguous trajectories that are possible. So the upward trajectory we're seeing at the moment is largely a consequence of the smart testing and targeting strategy of the Western Cape, which is picking up more new infections. The other provinces are not doing that, which means they're not picking up infections that may be there. Now, what does that translate into down the line? It might mean that, in fact, Western Cape, to a large extent, manages the epidemic because it's actually adopting the only strategy that will turn the epidemic down. But the other provinces are not actually producing the numbers. We don't really know what's going on. Most of the public hospitals are not reporting their COVID cases. So we have no sight other than in the Western Cape and the private sector of the number of COVID cases in hospital. And that's a check on your new infection data. And the mortality data also looks like it's tainted. And during this lockdown, the Home Affairs offices were shut down, which meant that they stopped recording deaths. So we don't actually have any surveillance on deaths during this period. So we have no hard checks on the trajectory. So what we don't know at this point is what the true trajectory of the epidemic is. We don't know if it's more serious or less serious.
Well, Alex, I'm glad you came in on the Western Cape there, because there's a lot of critics out there saying, well, the Western Cape, and they're calling it the Wuhan province of South Africa, and there's been a lot of political, noise around, the Western Cape, and you've seen the ANC in Parliament calling for the Western Cape to be kept in level 5 hard lockdown, when in fact, it's the one province where they're doing exactly what Professor Karim had suggested from the beginning, which is to go out and look for those small bushfires, the community infections, rather than having to deal with an inferno later. If you had one piece of advice for President Ramaphosa now, what would it be?
Well, we've got to move into essentially a targeted strategy going forward. So targeting means you target where the hotspots are. You do not shut down South Africa. So a targeted strategy means that you've got to have surveillance. If they've messed up our testing regime and contact tracing regime, which it appears they have, that can be progressively improved, but we will have to have workarounds to be able to identify hotspots and attack them very, very quickly. That is our only strategy. And to the extent that a lockdown is required, it is very, very targeted, not generalized. And to a large extent, it's not businesses that you shut down. It might be communities that are sequestered for a period until the problem is lifted. That limits the impact on the economy. Yeah. We cannot shut down the supply and the demand side of the economy simultaneously for an indefinite period. So that's the one that limits the damage to a large extent. So I see no other route other than that kind of strategy. I think we need a huge light shone on what's going on in terms of decision-making and the data and information, which needs to be made more generally available. And there needs to be an independent oversight on whether or not the information and data we're seeing is valid. Because there are too many points of intervention and too many instances where political imperatives may ultimately distort what information is made public. That has to end.
Yeah. Alex, why do you think government's not sharing the data with the media, with the public? Other countries around the world have been very open and transparent with the data and have made citizens partners in the combating of the virus. But we're not seeing nearly enough the same level of transparency by government here. And why, despite the fact that Professor Karim 2 weeks ago had started to question the efficacy of a continued hard lockdown, are we still in hard lockdown, do you think?
So, firstly, on the reasons for not being transparent, to be perfectly blunt, there is never a good reason behind not being transparent, but there are reasons. The reason would be that it can be you do not want to demonstrate incompetence, or you do not want people to be aware of the real reasons for your decisions. Those are the reasons that you'd have for a lack of transparency. The National COVID Council that has been the NCCC that has been established involves a massive concentration of power. And typically, where you concentrate power, you actually increase transparency. You don't diminish it. They've actually gone the route of diminishing it, which worries me. When the power goes together with a diminishing of transparency, it's never a good sign. So I would say that there's that probably people are hiding the reasons for their decisions. I think, but there can be, once one's in this territory, you just end up speculating. On the point of bringing people with one on these decisions, to a large extent, combating an epidemic of this nature requires a substantial degree of voluntary consent on the part of society. Voluntary consent. That means they must have some trust in what you're doing. They must see the sense of it. And they must be, it must be rational, and it must appear fair. the moment those kinds of principles are broken in an environment like this, you lose the voluntary consent, and you cannot enforce people, you cannot force down people's throats a compliance with these kinds of regimes. They must see that there's a purpose and a point. So I think that what's happening is that there's a distance now being created between the people who are making these decisions and an attempt to create consent on the part of society. And that is transparency forms part of that, when people just can't see why. And the last set of regulations that have been generated, I think, have completely lost the confidence of society in general, because they just cannot be explained.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. And I think this is a good chance to bring Dr. Susan Vosloo in. Obviously I follow you, Susan, and certainly very interesting. In one of your recent Facebook posts, you said that when will reporters and individuals realize that COVID-19 does not kill many people and definitely cannot kill businesses in our fragile economy, as so widely reported? Do you want to take us through what was behind that comment, Susan?
Yes,
and perhaps give us a bit of elaboration.
Certainly. I was approached by some friends who you shared the concern of many citizens, like you've mentioned, and I said, well, I'll write down what I think, because in the newspapers it's widely reported, like last Sunday, COVID kills Edcon. Now, a few strands of DNA cannot kill a business. I think what should really be clear is that the regulations, as a result of the fear of this virus, has done a lot of harm to the economy. Now, I'm not an economist, but we've also been locked down. We are functioning way below capacity, and we are, like most of the people in this country, reading the overload on social media. And in a way, with a background in medicine, you can do some informed perceptions. Now, I think in the end there are more questions than answers. I think the main question is, or some of the most important questions are, why does a disease with a fairly low mortality, worldwide definitely less than 1%, what's been quoted is 0.1 to 0.3%, and for this country, if you want to be blunt, up to 200,000 people will realistically die of this disease. And in no country has a lockdown really stopped the spread of the virus. That's quite exceptional in a few instances. We are very privileged in the Southern Hemisphere, where we are at the end of summer, that we can take lessons from the Northern Hemisphere, who's at the end of winter. And one just wonders, why is that information that's so widely available, and the absolutely growing information about the harmful effects of not allowing people to work, of not allowing children who have a very low risk of dying to go to school or to study, why is that perpetuated against the background of low risk and the inability really to stop what is going on? It makes no sense that a whole population, 99% plus of the population, is locked down to protect a small minority of people. Why can the small minority of people not be actively protected and the rest of the society be allowed to return to work? We have such a big population that live from hand to mouth. Even when the initial lockdown was announced, it was very clear that a lot of people that depend on weekly wages would run out of money after a week or two. It's now 2 months later, and I'm not sure what those people are doing. They don't just need food, they are fit and able to work and feed themselves, but they're not allowed to do that. I think that's the perception that really leaves a lot of people with many questions.
Dr. Vosloo, I want to ask you, and I mean, I'm not asking doctors to promote smoking, and I'm sure as a heart surgeon, smoking would be on the last of the list of things that you would be promoting. But is there a link between COVID-19 and tobacco, and what do you think underlies the tobacco ban in South Africa? It's the only country in the world, as far as I've been able to establish, where there's a tobacco ban in level 5 and now in level 4. Is there a link between COVID and tobacco? Have you guys found anything like that?
Well, we all read the literature like expert lay people, and I do not think that anybody will promote smoking as being healthy. In this context, the prohibition of smoking and alcohol makes little sense. I'm sure it's well meant, but I think the repercussions in terms of changing the activities, for instance, of law enforcement people to rather chase the irregular or illegal dealings in alcohol and cigarettes takes the focus totally from what the initial focus was. And I think that is a huge injustice in society.
Dr. Vosloo, I've got a great question here from a man called Herman Stein. He says, you mentioned we should consider quarantine for people at risk rather than the healthy population. He had a heart transplant in 2012, and he mentions that Dr. Ferreira was actually an anaesthetist. What would you advise people who've had heart transplants to be doing at this time? Should they be self-isolating and staying in quarantine, or are they as less risk as anybody else?
Any person with a reduced immune response will be at higher risk. But I think what I sense is that there is no regard for people to actually look after themselves. We should really be allowed as individuals to take care of our own health. A person who's had a heart transplant should take responsibility for their well-being. I don't think that it's necessary, for instance, to bring the whole country to a standstill to protect a handful of people, because the harm done to the bigger proportion of the society is far bigger than the risk for this small group of people.
Yeah. Well, thanks. And this is a good time to bring Dr. Ferreira in. And certainly if I read and listen to the comments that you made on RS here, pardon the pun, man after my own heart, saying here that you question the medical reasons for the lockdown, and you said that we should respect the virus but not fear it. Now, this is a point I made yesterday in the address I made to the nation, that the virus is, on the other side of the door, Dr. Ferreira, and we've been very good at hiding from the virus, but now it's time to open the door and confront the virus. What are your views on this, and what did you mean by saying that we should respect the virus but not fear it?
Well, just before I start, I must just sort of point out I'm definitely not an expert. And these are merely my own opinions, which I gathered while I watched the pandemic basically expose humanity. And the virus, why you should respect any disease-producing pathogen. And this virus, if you have to live through a pandemic, this is the one to choose. It's rapidly spread, it's very low virulence, and it spares you young people. It's not like the Spanish flu that killed the young people and was very virulent. So if you have to have a pandemic, this is the one. Why is there so much panic at the moment? It's totally, totally unsupported by the medical facts. I went through a long list of other pandemics, and this one doesn't even feature on the scale. One of the interesting ones was the Hong Kong flu in 68, 69. We didn't even kill a million people, and there were much less people in the world in those days. We had Woodstock in the middle of that. We didn't even know there was a pandemic going on. I mean, this pandemic is fueled by the press, the politicians, and by the internet. I mean, there's absolutely no reason to carry on like that. We have established a tyranny of fear that was driven by the press. I mean, they relate every death with bated breath as their main part of their news every day. Are they going to keep on counting till this pandemic is over? It's totally irresponsible what they're doing. The government sends me a message every morning that says, this virus kills. I mean, they're just sowing panic. This is an influenza. I mean, I can give you all the figures for all the countries. If you just look at the main amount of deaths per year from ordinary flu is 290,000 to 650,000. We're now at 300,000, probably totally over-reported. So we are now at the lower base of the average death from flu every year. And the ordinary flu, influenza A and B, targets us younger people. This one is targeting the old people. And as Alex said, the narrative changed. Suddenly, initially it was flattening of the curve, and now we're saving lives. We're saving lives. It's so emotional to say, it's very difficult to argue against that. But 70 to 80% of those people are going to be my age. We're going to be over 70 with comorbidities. Not to run around and say, I'm going to save your life. I've had my life. I'm not a child. You can't save my life. At the best, and I don't even think they can do that, is they might extend my life by a year or 2 or 3 or 4. But at what price? I don't want to ruin the future of my children and the whole country to give me another 2 or 3 years of life. That's absolutely a grotesque idea. So this is only emotional. It's just
Dr. Ferreira, I've got a query in here. You know, you've talked about comorbidities, etc. There's a query here from Liz, and she asks about high blood pressure. Is high blood pressure a comorbidity? And she says, do the pills that one takes make you more likely to get the virus?
Very, very, very good question. I just read about this morning. I never quite understood why they said high blood pressure and cardiac disease should be a comorbidity. And there was a very good interview. I can't vouch for it, but it made sense to me. And the interviewer, a doctor in America, said, it's not the high blood pressure or the cholesterol or the heart disease that's a comorbidity. It's the tablets we're taking for it. Like statins and ACE inhibitors, which is a drug for blood pressure, expresses the A2 gene or as a receptor, much more, doubles the receptor. And that may be a reason why these people are more severely affected. Because it makes no sense to say you've got high blood pressure, you're going to die from a respiratory infection. I mean, that makes no sense at all. But this might be an avenue to look at. They've also found out that, I mean, I'm just quoting people, I can't vouch for it, that if you have the influenza jab, which we all had, thinking, here comes the big hoha, your cytokine storm might be much worse if you get infected by the virus. So it may not even been a good idea to take influenza jab. Yeah. So, and as far as the lockdown, which is my great concern, is because I've said this virus is nothing. The real pandemic, which I say over and over again, is poverty and hunger. 20,000 people a day die from hunger. That's 600,000 a month. That's double what of the world death of corona at this stage. That's our problem. And nobody seems to pay any attention to that. Yeah. And as far as a lockdown is concerned, the Swedes were very clear. They said the only thing that you can manipulate a lockdown with is based on scientific fact. You said we won't do anything if it's not based in fact. And the politicians in Sweden are not allowed. This is an administrative decision. The politicians can't make this decision, which is great. And he said the only two facts that have been proven to modulate a pandemic is social separation and sanitation. He said there is no evidence that a lockdown will make any difference to the spread in the end. And he said the danger is if you run up this ladder of lockdown without any scientific basis, how do you come down? And we see it clearly today. They can't even decide what to do with the schools. They ran up this ladder, took all the kids out of school, and now they can't come down this ladder. They don't know what to do. We know for a fact that the kids don't die. I think 3 kids in America died in the whole epidemic so far, of which all 3 had serious comorbidities. The kids don't die of this. And the other interesting thing that's come out now, the kids don't pass it on to the adults. So they're going to be the main reason for the what we call the herd immunity or the general immunity in the population. They should be at school. I mean, this is crazy what's going on here. And what happened was it was not based on fact. It was based on political decision. Because the population panics, and the population panic due to models made by the academia that has been totally wrong. I mean, it's been proven to be totally wrong. So the population panic, and now what do the politicians do? They start panicking. So Boris and Donald both panicked, and they were on the way to herd immunity, and they panicked and went into a lockdown. The Swedes never went there. They said, we're not going to go that way. And as you said, the people bought into that. You said, there are no rules that you can break about this pandemic in Sweden. You said, we don't have any boots of police on the street because there's no new rules that you have to break. So they've been very, very clear and communicated it and the populace bought into that. They're completely calm about this whole epidemic. Everybody else is running around. And it's such a tyranny of fear that we today allow our old people to die alone. And the hospitals won't allow you for a family to come and visit the elderly. I mean, that's madness. That's absolute madness. And the same fear has caused this tremendous economic collapse. There is no lockdown in this country. I speak to the people I work with, and they just laugh. They said, no, they braai on the pavement, and when the police come, they run away. They don't even extinguish the fire, and they're back in half an hour. And they have you can see it on TV.
Talking about breaking the lockdown, Dr. Ferreira, I certainly hope that Mr. Patel is not watching the show, because it doesn't look to me like you're wearing that T-shirt as an undergarment or for warmth. So,
what I have is a mask in case Minister Zille wants it.
Okay, well, there we go. Good stuff. Well, thanks, Dr. Ferreira. Alex, I want to end with you, if I may. I just want to ask you, what are the data sets we should be looking for? What should government be publishing on a daily, a weekly basis that would give us the most up-to-date indicator about where we're at this? What is the data that government could, from tomorrow, start publishing that every citizen should be able to access?
Well, we need all of the data that talks to the trajectory and distribution of the epidemic. So you want to know where samples have been collected and submitted and the dates associated with that and from which areas, and at what point the test has been confirmed as either positive or negative. So that gives you a sense of both the intervention as well as the what you're discovering about the epidemic. You need the demographics around that, and you need the time taken, the response time before a test is completed to be clear in the data sets. You need to have the inpatient data, general ward, high care, ICU information. At the very minimum, you need to know the which hospital where, by hospital, not by province. And you need to know just the number in hospital at a point in time. The public sector and private sector. We need to know where the new infections are from that data set on a spatial basis at a very localized level. There's no coherent reason to hide the information, the granular information on new infections. You don't want to identify individuals, but that information doesn't identify individuals, and you want all of this information on a daily basis. So these are you want the mortality data to be there as a check, and when you've got that, you've got hard checks on your new infection data, which may not be a complete indication of the actual infections. We also need that information and efficacy studies of interventions. So on contact tracing, we need to know what number of contacts were traced per person that was identified as positive. We want to be able to test whether or not you're getting to 90% of the potential contacts or only 12%. If we're getting to 12%, you have no preventive effect from your from that intervention. So this is how you manage an epidemic. Your basic tools are testing and tracing. Do it at scale. On the issues of whether or not we can protect particular high-risk groups of people with this kind of strategy, we do have problems in being able to separate out high-risk people from everybody else. But we should, in our public health interventions, make every effort to identify and separate those people. But unless you're doing this on a surgical basis and measuring what we're doing and its effectiveness, we really don't know where we are.
Great. Well, thank you, Alex, Susan, and Anton, for being with us today. I'm sure that our Coronacast viewers have found it absolutely fascinating and great to have some experts on the show. So thank you for the time, and we look forward to maybe having you back again on Coronacast at some stage in the future. So thank you very much, and thanks for all you're doing to contribute to the debate around the coronavirus. Greatly appreciated. What was that, Dr. Ferreira?
Is there time for me to ask Alec a question?
No, not today. But I'll give you his WhatsApp, and we'll get you guys back on again sometime for a greater conversation. I'm going to turn now to my in-studio guest, my former leader and good friend, former Premier of the Western Cape, former Mayor of Cape Town, Helen Zille. And welcome back, Helen, to Coronacast. And you're here for a very important reason today. And let's first just talk through our legal action. So let's start off. Why have we decided to go the legal route as the DA in terms of the approach to the virus in South Africa?
Well, let's start with a point that Professor van den Heever made. He said that what we need for the population of South Africa is a bright light cast on the decisions that are being made behind closed doors and the data that is being given to the public in dribs and drabs to justify those decisions. And that's critical because it goes to the heart of the reason that we have a constitutional democracy, and that is that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we know that. We know that very well, and that's why all the checks and balances exist in our constitution. Now, what has happened under the Disaster Management Act is an extraordinary thing. And it can't happen under any other law in South Africa, not even the State of Emergency Act, which is one rung of the ladder above the Disaster Management Act. What has happened there is that it's allowed the Minister of COGTA, not even the executive, the Minister of COGTA, who is not the president, she is Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. She's the Minister of COGTA. It gives her absolute power to make a whole set of new laws that fundamentally change people's lives without going back to Parliament once, without having to be transparent about the data, without having to be transparent about the reasons. Now let's look at how many regulations and sets of regulations have come out. There have been 40 sets of regulations. That is hundreds of pages of new regulations and legislation that govern South Africans' lives in the most minute way. So, for example, you were a criminal if you went to visit your granny on Mother's Day. So, for example, everything has happened from banning open-toe shoes to mothballing entire industries.
Yes.
All in the name of fighting this virus, and all in this huge body of new legislation that has come out in the form of regulation. Now, in no other democracy would that be possible without reporting to Parliament and allowing a debate in Parliament. And even the state of emergency law says that after 3 weeks, if you want to extend the state of emergency, you have to go back to Parliament. And you can only extend it after a debate in Parliament where you have to give the reasons and be transparent about the data. And immediately after the President has declared a state of emergency, he has to go and proclaim it in Parliament and lay it before Parliament. So here you have the state of disaster, which is supposed to be a lesser state of restriction, which in fact makes the oversight required in section 27 of the Constitution, in section 55 of the Constitution, 42 of the Constitution and 55 of the Constitution. All of those mandated sections in the Constitution just wipes it away.
So let me stop you here. So potentially, as the law currently exists, we could stay in a state of national disaster for 2 months, 2 years, 20 years,
forever,
without there ever having to be a adjustment.
The minister and President Ramaphosa, in terms of the law, is just a front man for this. Not in terms of what people are saying. The person who the law delegates the power to is Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. That's the Disaster Management Act, because it falls under the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, and she's the minister. So when she makes a decision, and she can under this act, she can delay it, extend it, issue regulations, delegate the power to make all kinds of irrational regulations to all kinds of ministers like Ibrahim Patel. And what they've basically done is set up a legislature, a law-making body, without any of the checks and balances inside the executive. That completely violates the principle of the separation of powers, which is essential to prevent power abuse.
So let me stop you there then and ask you this question, because Cassius Labisi, in his response last week, said, but there's no problem. The NCC reports back to the Cabinet. Why is that a problem?
That's a problem because it's the Cabinet reporting back to itself.
Exactly.
I mean, the bottom line is that the NCC is a subcommittee of the Cabinet. So the executive can report back to itself all they like, but there's no oversight because they've got no independent oversight of themselves, that's for sure. And when the president stands up and speaks, he's basically speaking for the NCC, and the NCC has all the powers delegated to it by Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. No wonder there's this rift developing. So the critical thing that we have to do is get the questions asked in Parliament, get access to the data that Alex van der Heever says we need, ask all the hard questions about the rationality of banning crop-bottom pants, whatever they are, and open-toed shoes.
I'm still trying to work out what crop-bottom pants are.
Perhaps
we should get a fashion expert to the next Coronacast to take us through some of the more bizarre regulations on dress.
Well, absolutely, and banning all kinds of things, making you a criminal if you exercise in the afternoon, not allowing you to go and visit your dying grandmother in hospital. I mean, these laws that have been created overnight, you know how long it takes to make a law in Parliament?
Yeah.
It's public participation, it's the committee stage, it's 3 readings, it's all of the checks and balances in the public. They've created a whole new body of law in 7 weeks.
At a stroke of a pen.
At the stroke of a pen, and that go right to the heart of how we live our daily lives every day.
Absolutely right.
Without any oversight.
And you know, it could have been so different. I mean, you know, I think government may have had a loophole had they only listened to the request that we made at the beginning of this process to say, right, the NCC is not a committee, it's not a ministry, so let's create a facility for it to report back to Parliament. And so you would know right in the first week of the crisis, we put forward a proposal in Parliament, let's have an ad hoc committee on the NCC so that they can report back in. Instead, we've had, what's it now, how many weeks?
Going into the 8th.
8th week, with no oversight of the executive. The people's representatives who've been elected through a democratic election have been sidelined and silenced, and the executive are essentially running the country by diktat.
Yes, absolutely, and that's why we've challenged some of the more irrational things. I mean, we've also gone to court to challenge the curfew. Now, the curfew says you can't go out at night, and Ronald Amola's been very open about that. He says, well, it just makes it easier for the police.
So there's no health benefit from that. There's no
you're not more likely to get sick at night than during the day when you go and exercise.
The virus doesn't go to sleep.
Yeah, it absolutely doesn't go to sleep. So and it's certainly you're not more likely to be safe inside your home than outside or anywhere else. The critical thing is sanitization and mask wearing, which we completely support. But if they had set up this ad hoc committee to ask the questions, to challenge, to ask for reasons, and to scrutinize all of these incredible regulations that are coming out, it would have given that oversight. They've refused to do it. And now to defend Section 42 of the Constitution, to defend Section 55 of the Constitution, we're saying to the court, take those clauses that provide for parliamentary oversight in the State of Emergency Act and read them into the State of Disaster Act.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I mean, I think we've seen some of the folly of some of the stuff. I mean, this latest one around clothing, what you can wear, what you can't wear. I mean, it's going to be a cashier's nightmare when someone brings a T-shirt to the checkout and says, they're going to have to fill out a question, are you only going to wear this as an undergarment for warmth? Or it's just completely bizarre. I mean, you expect You expect this in a sort of draconian communist state, not in a... And, the other thing that really frustrates me is that, they limit the exercise to 3 hours in a day. Let's be honest, it's winter, so it's actually only really an hour and a half because it's dark and cold for the first part of it. And then they moan when there's all these people out on the streets and they say, oh, it's social distancing. Doesn't make sense.
It's completely contradictory. And one after the other. I mean, I desperately needed a mattress. And I went out yesterday and the guy said to me, sorry, you're a day late. Until yesterday, the regulations allowed us to sell mattresses, but today they don't.
Incredible.
Quite extraordinary.
Absolutely, absolutely incredible. And so, Helen, I mean, this importance because, what really worries me is that citizens get used to, it's human nature to adapt to changing circumstances. And it worries me that a lot of citizens are seemingly being lulled into this and said, well, it's for our own good because the government says so. We've got to guard against the permanence of the temporary. And that is why this court case is surely so important.
Anybody who takes their rights seriously as set out in the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, the right to free speech, the right to freedom of movement, the right to run a business and to support a business, the right to freedom of assembly, all of those rights must understand that they were very, very hard won and they can be taken away very easily, especially by a government that now is drunk on power and has to account to absolutely no one.
Yeah.
But what has worried me profoundly, let me be honest with you, John, about following social media, and I know social media doesn't reflect the population as a whole, is how easily people fall into the slipstream of autocracy. I suppose it's understandable at a time where all of this fear of this huge danger has been pumped up in the way that Dr. Ferreira described. It's really been pumped up. So in a time of terrible mortal fear, you look for the big man, you look for the big leader. But the point is, your rights can so easily be taken away, and when you need them and when you need the institutions that will stand up for them, they're no longer there.
Yeah. Well, I'm always reminded about Turkey. I mean, there's a great example. So you had a country that was the model of democracy in that region of the world, on the verge of admittance into the European Union, and within 3 short years, a totalitarian dictatorship completely happened overnight. And so citizens, I think, have a duty, particularly for future generations. This is a hard fought for freedom in South Africa, and it shouldn't be taken for granted. And this is a fight worth having. Going forward to ensure secure for future generations freedom.
Some people have said to me, Helen, why are you now so keen on taking these technical points? People see them as technical points that are unrelated to the virus. Well, they're not technical points. They are related fundamentally to rights that every individual citizen has. The things that aren't related to the virus is banning open-toe shoes, or saying you can't buy cooked food, or saying that what temperature food has to be when you buy it. I mean, these are precious freedoms. We don't think of buying a roast chicken as a precious freedom, but it's certainly going to become one if we don't wake up.
I think wearing a T-shirt is going to become a revolutionary act.
No, well, don't be that subversive. I'm glad you're not being subversive today, John.
But talking about revolutionary acts, I think there's a big misconception out there that what the DA is trying to do is to take South Africa back to the pre-COVID world and pretend that COVID doesn't exist. When in fact nothing could be further from the truth. They say, oh well, you're going to courts that you can have your life back to normal. We all know life's not going to be normal, certainly for the next 18 to 24 months.
What's on the DA's mind more than anything else is the between 3 million and 7 million people who stand to lose their jobs. Now, before we went
on top of 10 million people who are already unemployed.
Exactly. That's where we were before COVID. Now, every person, especially every person who's blessed enough to have a secure job, should think of nothing else than what we're going to do when potentially up to 17 million people are unemployed in South Africa. Now, as Dr. Ferreira was saying, and I agree with him, and Alex van der Heever was also saying in a different way, the mortality risk of this virus was dramatically overstated, but the economic impact has been dramatically understated. And anybody out there who still thinks it's a choice between lives and livelihoods has lost it. 20,000 people die of malnutrition in the world today, and every day, and that is a horrific statistic, and it's going to visit our shores again.
Good question here from Densol Williams, Helen.
Oh, yes.
It says, why are members of Parliament not debating about this in Parliament like the UK and other democracies are doing?
Well, that's the critical point.
Great question, I think.
Great question, great point, and that's why we're going to court, Denzel. That's exactly why we're going to court. Because what we see right now is the people's representatives can't ask your kinds of questions in Parliament, can't ask the questions that Alex van der Heever has been asking. Are you fudging the numbers? Are you being honest about testing for the cause of death? Are you actually getting the numbers and finding the bushfires? Dr. van den Heever says the only province that has got accurate statistics and is fighting this virus properly is the Western Cape. But the ANC's propaganda is the dead opposite. Now, we can't have that debate in Parliament and get all the facts on the table as we should be.
Yeah. I've got a question here. It's an interesting one, and it relates to an event yesterday around an interview that ended abruptly. Do you think that that the virus and the response to the lockdown, etc., is driven on racial grounds? I certainly don't think. The impression I've got is that there are a lot of South Africans across all racial lines who are really worried about their future, and you know, I'm reminded here of that terrible scene of that elderly woman being arrested for nothing more than trying to sell atchar, which is probably the only means they have to keep their family going, and her being chucked into the back of a police van. And to me, it just shows that this inordinate response has got an effect, and it's going to affect South Africans across the length and breadth.
Well, 100%. There are people in South Africa, and it's only a small elite who try to see everything in terms of race because they've probably been to one of the English-speaking universities in South Africa and have been fed with a diet of nothing else than critical race theory. So everything has to be reduced to race, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. That's how they see it. This virus doesn't know race. It doesn't know class. But what it does know is that the response to this virus is going to dump millions of more South Africans into extreme poverty. That is not being able to feed themselves every day.
Yeah.
And if we're not worried about them, and if we're not standing up for them, we don't have a reason to exist.
Well, Ross Ashmore asks you, when does the court action take place? Do you want to just let us know where we're sitting at the moment?
Well, in this particular court action around the unconstitutionality of the Disaster Management Act, we're going straight to the Constitutional Court. Now, that cuts the process very,
so we're seeking
very
direct access?
We are seeking direct access for the simple reason that it is critical. We cannot have this disaster, the state of disaster, extended in perpetuity or indefinitely with all of these absurd regulations coming out. And that's why we're asking for direct access to the Constitutional Court. It's hard to get, and I can't promise you will get it, but we're asking for it. On the other cases, well, already there's been a relenting on e-commerce, which is a good thing, but it was absurd ban to start with.
Yeah.
And then we are also asking for the curfew to be changed and the exercise hours to be changed. I mean, you know, the interesting thing that Dr. Ferreira said is Sweden didn't have to have any more police on the streets or the army out there because they didn't have to make any laws. They simply said to people, just be careful. These are the things you have to do. Sanitize. Keep social distancing. They didn't even say wear masks, but because we know that this disease is spread by droplets that come when you talk or when you interact with people, so we wear a mask. That really does protect yourself and other people. But you don't need this huge military response. We've got 76,000 soldiers on the street.
But here's the thing that doesn't make sense to me, right? So we saw the 3 weeks, the initial 3-week hard lockdown, then it was extended by 2 weeks. There was no military curfew, anything. And I saw that the HSRC put out a report saying 99% of South Africans had abided by the regulations. Why is there now a need then to, in a relaxed thing, put in place a military curfew enforced by all these soldiers that you talk about?
Well, you know, I don't think that that particular statistic was entirely accurate. But even if it wasn't accurate, you don't let soldiers loose on the street. I mean, as Alex van den Heever was saying, the obvious point is that lockdown cannot work in some communities because you can't lock down with 5 people in a shack. And if that's
no deep freeze.
Exactly. Yeah. So if that strategy isn't going to work, it's a bad strategy for your particular country. And that is precisely what he was saying. So what you try and do with lockdown is to buy time to develop a capacity to drive a strategy of testing, tracing, tracking, and getting your hospital system ready that otherwise you wouldn't have. It's the only reason.
Great. Well, there's a question here from Cherie Tatzel. Can the ANC change our constitution? And I think there's a lot of alarm that has arisen from an advert that appeared in the paper calling for people who want to make constitutional amendments. But I mean, I think that we can put people's mind at rest that that is an annual process that is required by law.
But the other thing is that through this act, which is why we think it's unconstitutional, they can bypass the Constitution.
Yeah.
They can bypass Section 55 of the Constitution. They can bypass Section 42 of the Constitution. And that is why the Disaster Management Act is unconstitutional, because they can just ignore the Constitution as they have been doing. And that is why we are taking it straight to the Constitutional Court, for that reason.
So do you think it was an omission in the Disaster Management Act, or do you think it was a deliberate omission?
I think it was, and I almost have to ask myself, where were we in the DA? Why didn't we jump up and down at the time to say, excuse me, this allows for a much more stringent situation than a state of emergency. So, we've got to be very, very, very vigilant. You're not creating these kinds of laws for Nelson Mandela, You're creating these kinds of laws for Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma when she is the Minister of Cogta. And that is where we now are.
What do they say? The price of liberty is
Freedom
eternal vigilance. And I
Eternal
suppose there's a lesson for all of us.
Absolutely.
Is there anything you want to add on the court case, Helen? Is there any just final thoughts that you want to have? I mean, these things are expensive, obviously.
Oh, they're very expensive. And it is wonderful that people responded so generously yesterday. And obviously, I also did, so I tried to do my
done. I saw your money coming in. Thank you very much.
I did my donate, but the trouble is that it was very overloaded when I tried to, so I got a little error message. But then when I checked on my SMS, I saw that it actually had gone through, so I was very relieved about that. So that is very important. I cannot tell you how much money we have to pay on these court cases, but
they are important.
It is the last defence. And what is so encouraging about South Africa at the moment is that we do keep communicating with each other, and now we have direct communication, so we don't have to rely on, with respect, many biased journalists to convey what we're trying to say. We can go direct.
Don't I know that?
Yeah. And in fact, then we can also use the Constitution and the law when the executive bypasses the Constitution and the law.
Right.
And that is one of the great things about South Africa. And we fight on. We don't just lie down and say, die baas het gepraat.
Jammer dat ons leef.
Jammer dat ons leef, die baas het gepraat.
No, that's absolutely important. I think there's people understand this is the role of an opposition in a democracy. Yes, there are times when you've got to work together, but we also have a role to hold the executive to account. And it's not a travesty. It is the job we've been elected to do.
It's the patriotic thing to do. Otherwise, the day after tomorrow, South Africans wake up with no rights and wonder where somebody was to defend their rights.
Yeah.
Well, those people are here doing it.
Well, thank you, Helen. It's always great to have you on the show. And you always certainly you have a unique perspective, and it's really great. Yes. Colleagues, that's what we have time for this week, and I hope you found this interesting. I'm sorry it's been a bit longer than usual, but with the experts here and the excitement around the court case, these things do tend to go on a bit longer. But for those of you who've been feeling powerless and unable to express yourself, donating to this court case could be your chance to make your voice heard. So please visit our website, www.da.org.za, and make a contribution. This is a fight not only in your interest, but in the interest of future generations. We've got to keep the flame of freedom burning here in South Africa, and we need to make sure that we're able to hold government to account. I usually, at this time of the show, do a shout-out and to somebody who's done well. But today, I want to pay tribute to Lungile Tom, who was a cameraman for ENCA, and who I had the privilege of working with on so many occasions as he covered stories in Parliament. He was a larger-than-life character, always ready with a laugh and with a joke, and an absolute pleasure to work with. And we sadly lost him this week to COVID-related disease, and unfortunately, I think that our media space is a lot poorer without him. And so our condolences go out to the friends, the family, the loved ones, the colleagues of Lungile Tom, who was a shining light in our media environment. That's it all for this week, folks. And don't forget to tune in on Tuesday again, same time, same place. We look forward to having another action-filled episode of Coronacast for you. Until then, South Africa, stay safe.